The man was dying. Sarah could see it in the gray pallor creeping across his face, in the way his chest stuttered between breaths, in the numbers bleeding red across the monitors. He had maybe 20 minutes. Maybe less. He needed surgery. He needed it now. What he didn't need was to be left on a gurney in Bay 7 while the attending physician stood in the hallway, arms folded, speaking in a low voice on his cell phone. Dr. Harrison. Sarah's voice cut through the controlled chaos of the ER. We need you in here. His pressure's dropping. Dr. Richard Harrison turned slowly. He looked at Sarah the way powerful men look at people they consider inconvenient, with the mild, unhurried contempt of someone who knows the consequences fall on everyone else. I'm aware, he said. He didn't move. And in that moment, in the space between his words and his stillness, Sarah Kowalski understood that something was very, very wrong. The man's name, she would learn later, was Daniel Malone. 28 years old, 5'11", blood type A positive, currently serving as vice president of the Iron Ravens Motorcycle Club, Greater Boston chapter, a fact that had become apparent the moment the paramedics wheeled him through the double doors. The leather cute was cut away with trauma shears per protocol, but the patches were unmistakable even in tatters. Top rocker, Iron Ravens. Bottom rocker, Massachusetts. Center patch, a skull-faced crow with wings spread black against a blood-red circle. The paramedic, a thick-necked man named Luis who'd been doing this job for 11 years, leaned close to Sarah as they transferred Danny to the gurney in Bay 7. Truck versus motorcycle, Luis murmured. No helmet. Blunt chest trauma. Suspected splenic laceration. Possible TBI. GCS was 12 on scene, dropped to 9 en route. He hesitated. His brothers called it in. About a dozen of them are 10 minutes behind us. Sarah nodded. In 15 years of emergency nursing, 15 years of double shifts and short-staffed holidays, and the particular violence of the world arriving unannounced at sliding glass doors, she had treated Iron Ravens members. She had treated Bloods, Crips, MS, 13 affiliates, a city councilman stabbed by his business partner, a kindergarten teacher who'd been rear-ended at 50 miles an hour, and every gradation of humanity in between. In Bay 7, everyone bled red. That was the deal. That was medicine. That was the whole point. She got to work. At 1:43 a.m., she activated the trauma protocol. She ordered a CBC, BMP, coagulation panel, type, and cross-match. She pushed the first bolus of normal saline and watched Danny's blood pressure on the monitor, 94/60. She applied oxygen and placed a second large-bore 4. She spoke to Danny, calmly, steadily, the way she spoke to every patient. And he responded with the confused half-awareness of someone whose brain was working against the fog of shock and injury. You're at St. Michael's. We've got you. Your family's on their way. His eyes found her face briefly. His lips moved. Marcus, he said, or something like it. We'll get him in to see you as soon as we can, Sarah said. His blood pressure dropped to 88/54. Dr. Richard Harrison arrived 4 minutes after she'd initiated the protocol. For minutes during which Danny's pressure had slid from 94 to 88, and during which Sarah had gotten everything ready for the physician who was supposed to walk in and take command of the situation. Harrison was 54, silver-haired, built with the particular authority of a man who has never seriously questioned his own judgment. He had trained at Johns Hopkins, practiced at 3 Boston hospitals before St. Michael's, and was known in the department for his diagnostic precision, his impatience with residents he considered slow, and his membership in a golf club whose annual dues exceeded Sarah's mortgage payment. He walked into Bay 7, looked at the patient, and then looked at the floor, at the shredded leather cute, at that distinctive crow. He reached for his phone. Sarah watched him make the call. 60 seconds, maybe 70. His voice was too low to catch the words. When he finished, he slipped the phone into his white coat pocket, and his face, when he turned back to the room, was composed in a way it hadn't been before, the composed stillness of a decision already made. What's his insurance status? Harrison asked. Sarah stared at him. I don't have that information yet. His pressure is, get me his insurance information before we proceed with any further workup. Dr. Harrison, his pressure is 88/54 and dropping. I need orders. He needs a CT of the abdomen and pelvis, surgicals, cancel surgical. The words fell into the room like stones dropped into still water. Sarah heard them. Her brain processed them. Some part of her, the part that had spent 15 years learning to trust the patterns of emergency medicine, the rhythms of crisis and response, refused them. "I'm sorry," she said. "Cancel the surgical consult." Harrison picked up the chart, glanced at it, set it down. He didn't perform a physical examination. He didn't look at the monitor. "Run your labs. Get imaging. But I'm not calling in the surgical team at 2 in the morning for this." "For this," Sarah repeated. Her voice was very careful. "For a patient with suspected internal bleeding and a pressure in the 80s. For a patient whose coverage status is unclear and he doesn't have a DNR. His next of kin will understand the clinical realities. His next of kin isn't here yet." Sarah held her ground. "And even if they were, that wouldn't change his clinical status. He has suspected active bleeding. Without surgical evaluation, without viable insurance verification, the hospital's liability exposure. I don't care about liability exposure." The words came out flat and certain, surprising her with their completeness. "I care about the patient in front of me." Harrison looked at her then, a full, deliberate look. He was a man who had rarely been contradicted by a nurse in 26 years of practice, and the way he looked at Sarah now was not angry, exactly. It was something quieter and far more dangerous, the absolute, unhurried confidence of a man who had never once faced a consequence that mattered. "Nurse Kowalski," he said softly, "I would suggest you consider very carefully the position you are putting yourself in." Then he turned and walked out. Sarah stood beside Danny Malone's gurney in the silence that followed, the monitor beeping its steady, anxious rhythm, the 4-bag dripping, the numbers on the screen sliding downward, and made the kind of decision that doesn't feel like a decision in the moment. It feels like the only thing left. She picked up the phone. "This is Kowalski in the ED. I need Dr. Patel down here right now. Bay 7. Trauma patient, suspected splenic lac, BP in the 80s. I know the consult was canceled. I'm reinstating it. Come down." She hung up. Then she crossed to the computer terminal and began to document. Every vital sign, every timestamp, every order and counterorder. Harrison's exact words. The time he had stood in the hallway. The fact that he had canceled a surgical consult without examining the patient, without ordering a fast ultrasound, without performing any physical assessment whatsoever. She documented it all with the careful, methodical precision of someone who understood that in the war she had just started, paper was ammunition. Dr. Priya Patel arrived 7 minutes later, still pulling on her white coat, her dark hair escaping its braid. She was 29 years old, 3 months into her residency placement, with the focused intensity of someone who had not yet learned to protect themselves from the full weight of what this work required, which, in Sarah's experience, was either a limitation or a gift, depending on the night. Patel looked at Danny. She looked at his numbers. She looked at Sarah. "Who canceled the consult?" she asked. "Dr. Harrison." Patel pulled on her gloves. "Give me an ultrasound machine," she said, "and call the OR." They worked in efficient silence, Patel running the fast exam, while Sarah hung blood and pushed medications, both of them aware with a particular, focused awareness that a man's life was happening in real time under their hands. The ultrasound image filled the screen, black pockets of free fluid in Morrison's pouch, in the spinorenal space, unmistakable. "Active bleed," Patel said quietly. She looked at Sarah with the expression of someone who has just understood the full shape of the situation. "We need the OR now." Harrison came back 12 minutes later. He came through the treatment area doors with the tight-jawed energy of a man who had made a call, received instructions, and was now here to manage a problem. His tie was the same, but his eyes had changed. The unhurried contempt had been replaced by something sharper. "Who authorized the surgical consult?" he demanded. "I did," Patel said, not looking up from the ultrasound screen. "There's free fluid in Morrison's pouch and the spinorenal space. Active bleed. We're going to the OR. Dr. Patel, you are a first-year resident and you do not have the authority." "She had my authority," Sarah said. Harrison turned. In the monitor light, his face was precise and cold. "Step outside with me," he said to Sarah. "Quiet. Controlled. I'm not leaving this patient." That was not a request. Then it can remain unmet. She held his gaze. "Dr. Patel, please proceed with or activation." Harrison leaned close enough that she could smell his cologne, expensive, suffocating. "You are going to lose your license," he said, just above a whisper. Your career is over. I will make sure of it personally. Sarah thought about Emma, 12 years old, asleep 6 blocks away under Mrs. Petrowski's watch, in their apartment with the water stain on the hallway ceiling that the landlord had been promising to fix for 3 years. She thought about the mortgage payment due in 11 days. She thought about 15 years of her life given to this building, this department, this calling. She thought about a compass rose tattoo on the inside of a young man's wrist. Then I guess that's what's going to happen, she said. She turned back to her patient. Harrison stood in the doorway for a moment that felt very long. Then he left. Sarah exhaled, one slow, controlled breath, the kind you take when your hands need to be steady. Thank you, Patel said softly, without looking up. Thank me when he's out of surgery, Sarah said. She reached for her personal cell phone. She sent 2 texts. The first, Jake, you awake? I have a story. The second, to a number she hadn't used in 8 months, Dr. Okafor. I need you. Tonight. Something very wrong is happening at your hospital. They came in like a weather front. A pressure change in the air that preceded their appearance. A shift in the room's energy felt before it was seen. The Iron Ravens arrived at St. Michael's at 2:19 a.m. 14 men in leather and road-worn denim walking through the sliding glass doors in near silence, which was somehow more arresting than if they had arrived with noise. The waiting room went still. The man at the front was not the largest of them, but he was the one every eye went to first. Perhaps 45, built like a man who had spent his life in physical work, broad through the shoulders, with hands that could have belonged to a longshoreman or a carpenter or a man who fixed engines in a garage at midnight because someone needed them fixed. His hair was dark going silver at the temples, and his face, under the fluorescent lights, was controlled in a way that spoke not of coldness but of enormous, disciplined effort. The effort of a man who is very afraid and has decided that fear is not something he will show. His cute read, President, Marcus King Malone. He walked to the triage desk and spoke to the nurse in a voice lower and quieter than his presence suggested possible. My brother was brought in. Danny Malone. I need to know his status. The triage nurse, credit to her, did not flinch. Sir, I'll need you to. Please. The word came out stripped of everything except what it was. A brother asking. Please, just tell me if he's alive. Sarah had come out of Bay 7 in time to hear it. She stood in the treatment area doorway and watched Marcus Malone say, please with everything he had, and she made her second decision of the night. She walked across the waiting room floor toward him. Mr. Malone. She stopped in front of him. 14 men looked at her, 5'4", teal scrubs with a coffee stain on the sleeve, brown hair and a ponytail that had been neat 8 hours ago. I'm Sarah Kowalski. I'm the nurse who's been treating your brother. Something moved behind Marcus's eyes, a tidal thing, contained at enormous expense. Is he? He's alive. He has a splenic laceration causing internal bleeding. We're taking him to surgery right now. The surgical team is excellent. She paused. I need you to know that your brother is going to receive every resource this hospital has. I am personally making sure of that. The way she said personally, the weight she loaded onto that word, was not lost on Marcus Malone. He was a man who had run an organization for 20 years by reading people with accuracy. He heard the subtext. Why are you telling me that specifically? He asked quietly. Because you should know, Sarah said. He held her gaze for a moment. Then, thank you. The man to his right, a barrel-chested figure with a sergeant-at-arms patch and the road name Roadblock, stepped forward and murmured something in Marcus's ear. Marcus's expression didn't change, but his eyes did. Detective Mike Russo walked through the ER doors the way he always entered rooms, like he owned them. 47, gray-haired, with the particular physical authority of a man who had been large since high school and had never had to argue for respect. His badge was out before he'd fully cleared the doorframe. Marcus Malone, he said. Long time. Detective. Marcus's voice had gone flat as winter asphalt. Got a call about a disturbance. Hospital security feeling threatened. Nobody here is threatening anyone, Sarah said. Russo looked at her with the same measured, dismissive appraisal Harrison had used earlier, and Sarah noted this, filed it, stacked it with everything else she was building. And you are Sarah Kowalski, RN. The only disturbance in this room is that I have a patient in surgery and a group of concerned family members standing quietly in a waiting room in the middle of the night. Russo let the pause extend. His eyes swept over the Iron Ravens, counting, assessing, then returned to Marcus. We've had a tip about outstanding warrants. Illegal possession of a firearm. I'm going to need you to come with me. I don't carry, Marcus said. We'll sort that out at the station. Sarah watched the calculation move through Marcus's face. The same calculation she had made twice already tonight, in different forms. Fight this. Or endure it and find another way. She watched him weigh the 14 men behind him, weigh Danny in the oar, weigh the math of what escalation would cost. He put his hands behind his back. Roadblock, he said, very quiet. Make sure my brother gets out of surgery okay. King, make sure. He looked at Sarah one last time. Ms. Kowalski, take care of my brother. I will, she said. She watched them lead Marcus Malone out through the sliding doors into the parking lot full of Harleys, and she felt something she hadn't felt since nursing school, since the first time she'd stood beside a dying patient and understood the true weight of what she'd signed up for. Righteous, clean, bone-deep fury. She pulled out her phone and texted Jake Torres again. Are you here yet? It just got bigger. Jake Torres arrived at 3:15 a.m. with a notebook, a recorder, and the particular electric alertness of a reporter who has not slept and does not care. Sarah met him in the break room, sat across from him, and in 20 minutes laid out everything. The documentation, printed with hands that were steady only because she made them steady, covered the table between them. Timestamps, vitals, every order and counterorder, Harrison's exact words transcribed in real time. The canceled consult, Jake said, reading through the pages. Can you prove he canceled it without examining the patient? I documented it as it happened. There are security cameras in the hallway, and the surgical resident who reinitiated the consult will corroborate. Will she talk? Sarah thought of Priya Patel, the look on her face when she'd said thank you. Yes. Jake tapped his pen. This isn't just negligence. You said he made a call when he arrived, and again when he came back. You're suggesting he was instructed. I'm suggesting a physician canceled a critical surgical consult for a patient in hemorrhagic shock without performing any examination, after receiving a phone call, after noting the patient's MC affiliation. Sarah met Jake's eyes. I'm also suggesting that within 20 minutes of that patient's brothers arriving at the hospital, arriving quietly, legally, saying please, a detective showed up and arrested their president on charges that materialized from nowhere. What does that suggest to you? Jake was quiet for a moment. Then, the Vega cartel. They've been moving into Iron Raven's territory. Incidents I couldn't pin down. If Harrison is on Vega's payroll, then this isn't the first time this has happened here. Jake sat up. I need to look at other cases. Other Iron Raven's members who came through this ER. I need that too. Can you pull medical board complaints? Court records. By 6 a.m.? If I start now, yes. He looked at her across the table. Sarah, you understand that once I publish, he told me I would lose my license, she said. He may be right, but I watched a corrupt cop arrest an innocent man 20 feet from where his brother is on an operating table, and I stood here and let it happen because I didn't know what else to do in that moment. She stood up. I know what to do now. Jake nodded once and opened his laptop. Carla Mendez, nursing assistant, 19 years at St. Michael's, a woman who knew which hallways had blind spots in the camera coverage, had been waiting for Sarah in the corridor outside the break room. Carla was 35, with the careful watchfulness of someone who had learned that information was both power and liability. Her husband rode with the Iron Raven's New Hampshire chapter. She had heard things. She had seen things. She had, tonight, been watching Harrison very carefully. The second call, Carla said, low and quick. The one he made in the ambulance bay. I saw the number. She pressed a folded napkin into Sarah's hand. I'm not on record. I can't be on record. But Jake can work with that. Sarah looked at the napkin. You understand what this means for you if it comes out. Carla's jaw was set. Danny Ghost used to deliver groceries to my grandmother when she couldn't get out. Every Tuesday for 2 years. Wouldn't take a cent. She held Sarah's gaze. I've known about Harrison for a while. I just didn't have anyone brave enough to go first. A pause. Now I do. Dr. Patricia Okafor arrived at 40 minutes past 3. She had driven from her home in Newton to St. Michael's in the middle of the night, and anyone who knew her understood what this meant. She considered this an emergency of the highest order. She was 52, had been chief of medicine for 9 years, and moved through the hospital with the authority of a woman who had fought for every square foot of her position and had never stopped being angry about what that fight had required. She read Sarah's documentation standing in the corridor, reading glasses on, pages held at arm's length. When she finished, she lowered the papers. When he said, "You are going to lose your license," Okafor said, "This is exact." Exact. A silence. Then, "He has done something like this before." Sarah went still. 18 months ago, an Iron Ravens member, GSW. Harrison was the attending. The patient survived, but response times were anomalous. Okafor removed her glasses. "I opened an inquiry. It went nowhere. Harrison's father-in-law sits on the board of trustees." Her voice was precise and dry. "The investigation was described as inconclusive. He's been allowed to keep practicing. He has been allowed to keep practicing." Okafor agreed, with a particular emphasis on the passive construction that contained an entire history. She looked at Sarah. "I have been waiting for a case I could take all the way. Airtight. Documented. Witnessed." A pause. "You may have just handed it to me. What happens to me in the meantime?" Okafor considered this for a long, honest moment. "I can protect you through the formal review process. After that, it depends on what the board finds." She paused. "I want you to know, Sarah, what you did tonight was either the bravest or the most reckless thing I have witnessed a nurse do in my entire career. Is there a difference?" Sarah asked. Dr. Patricia Okafor, for the first time that night, smiled. "Sometimes," she said, "there isn't. The next 4 hours move the way time moves in crisis. Not in a line, but in pools, surging and receding, stretching to nothing, and then collapsing back." Sarah stayed. She was technically off shift at 4 a.m. She did not leave. She sat in the surgical waiting room with Roadblock and 2 other ravens, Shepherd, gray-bearded and quiet, who might have been 50 or 70 and had the stillness of someone who had waited out many bad nights, and a young man barely 20 whose road name she didn't know yet, who kept walking to the window and back, burning nervous energy the only way he knew how. Roadblock, Frank Santos, father of 3, owner of a legitimate auto body shop in Quincy, a man who had been riding with the Iron Ravens for 18 years, sat with his huge hands open on his knees and told her, at some point around 4:30 a.m., about Dorchester. About a mother who worked double shifts at a laundromat until a stroke took her when Marcus was 23 and Danny was 16. About Marcus taking over, not dramatically, not by announcement, but just by doing whatever needed to be done. Groceries, school pickups, making sure Danny finished his homework, protecting him from the streets the only way Marcus knew how, which was by being present, always present, a wall of a brother between Danny and everything that wanted to swallow a fatherless boy in that neighborhood. Danny was going to be an engineer, Roadblock said. He looked at his hands. He was smart, really smart, took after their mom. He had 2 years of community college done. Then she died, and he shook his head slowly. He stayed. To be near Marcus. That's just who Danny is. Or was. Is. He corrected himself with the urgency of someone who needed the present tense to be true. Sarah thought about Emma, about what it means to choose to stay. At 5:10 a.m., the doors opened. Dr. Imani Wolf, lead trauma surgeon, compact and calm, with the particular unhurried authority of someone who has done this 500 times, walked out in her scrubs and looked at the group assembled in the waiting room with the expression of someone delivering news she is relieved to be delivering. "Splenectomy performed successfully," she said. "No additional major vascular injury. The bleed is controlled. He's in recovery. Barring complications, he's going to make a full recovery." The waiting room, the men in leather, the plastic chairs, the humming air, exhaled. Roadblock covered his face with one enormous hand. The young one, barely 20, sat down heavily in a plastic chair and stared at the ceiling with eyes too bright for the fluorescent light. Shepherd bowed his gray head and moved his lips in something that might have been a prayer. Sarah put her hand on Roadblock's shoulder, briefly. He reached up and covered it with his own, just for a moment. The gesture of a man not accustomed to accepting comfort accepting it anyway, because the night had cost too much for pride to have any value left. "Thank you," he said, muffled against his hand. "Thank Dr. Patel," Sarah said, "and Dr. Wolf, and your brother for being strong enough to make it to us." She meant it. She meant all of it. Harrison returned at 5:45 a.m. through the back entrance. which told her he'd been briefed and was managing his approach. He found Sarah at the nurse's station, completing her documentation, and stood across the desk from her with the demeanor of a man who has spent the night restructuring his position. "Nurse Kowalski," he said, "I've spoken to administration. The patient is stable. That's good news. What isn't good news is the documentation characterizing my clinical decisions in a frankly defamatory. The documentation is accurate," Sarah said, not looking up. "Every word. You'll be hearing from Dr. Harrison." She looked up. Dr. Okafor arrived at 4 a.m. She has been reviewing the chart since 4:15. I'd suggest you speak to her before you speak to anyone else. Something moved in Harrison's face, the first thing that looked genuinely like fear. He turned and walked toward the administrative corridor without another word. Sarah's phone buzzed. A text from Jake. "It's up." She looked at the time. 6:02 a.m. The morning light was beginning to gray the windows. She closed her documentation. She had been awake for 22 hours. She did not feel tired at all. The article ran in the Metro Globe under the headline, "Death by Delay. Documents expose Dr. Harrison's pattern of selective treatment at St. Michael's ER." Jake had worked with the speed and precision of a reporter who understood that a story like this has a window, a moment before institutions close ranks and lawyers get involved, and the truth becomes legally complicated. In addition to Sarah's documentation, quoted at length, timestamps and all, he had obtained 3 previously filed complaints from the Massachusetts Medical Board involving Harrison, each involving patients with gang or motorcycle club affiliations, each classified as inconclusive. He had spoken, on background, to a former St. Michael's resident who described a culture of selective urgency in Harrison's department. He had quoted Carla's information about the phone call without naming her. He had confirmed with Priya Patel, on the record, her voice quoted directly, that she had been called to override a canceled consult for a patient in critical condition. He had noted, in paragraph 14, that Marcus Malone had been arrested on firearms charges that, as of press time, were supported by no physical evidence and had resulted in no charges being filed. By 7 a.m., 11,000 shares. By 8 a.m., the Massachusetts Medical Board issued a statement announcing an expedited review. By 8:30 a.m., Marcus Malone was released from holding, the fabricated charges evaporating in the morning air. Sarah was still at the hospital when Marcus walked back through the ER doors. He looked different in the morning light, older, somehow, and less armored. There was dried blood on the knee of his jeans from where he'd knelt in the road next to his brother before the ambulance arrived. He hadn't noticed it or had noticed it and decided it didn't matter. He crossed the waiting room and stopped in front of Sarah and didn't say anything for a moment. "Your brother's in recovery," she said. "He's been asking for you." Marcus Malone, president of the Iron Ravens MC, a man who had been hard since he was 23 and had led people through things that would break most people, pressed his lips together and looked at the ceiling for one long, private moment. Then he looked at her. "The article," he said. "That was you. A friend of mine wrote it. But you gave him everything." "Yes. Harrison said you'd lose your license." "He did say that. Will you?" Sarah considered. "Probably not now. Dr. Okafor is formidable, but I don't know yet." Marcus nodded slowly. The appraising look of a man who has spent his entire adult life reading intentions, because his life has depended on reading them correctly, settled on her face. "Why did you do it?" he asked. It was the same question as 2:30 a.m., but it meant something different now. Now he knew what it had cost. Sarah thought for a moment. "My daughter is 12, she said. "I think about what I want her to see when she looks at me. What kind of choices I want her to know are available to people." She paused. "And because your brother deserved to live. That's really all there is to it." Marcus Malone held out his hand. Sarah Kowalski shook it. "Come on," she said quietly. He's been waiting for his brother. The door to room 412 was ajar. Sarah pushed it open and stepped back to let Marcus through, and she stood in the doorway for only a moment, long enough to see Danny Malone, pale and monitored and tubed, but alive and present, turn his head and see his brother come through the door, long enough to see Marcus cross the room in 3 strides, long enough to hear Danny's voice, hoarse, weak, and absolutely certain, say Marcus. "Hey, I'm okay." Long enough to see Marcus take his brother's hand in both of his and bow his head over it, and to hear what Marcus said, which was very quiet and very simple. "I've got you, kid. I've got you. She let the door close. In the hallway, Roadblock was studying the floor with considerable intensity. His jaw was working. Hey, Sarah said softly. Yeah, Roadblock said. A long pause. Yeah. He looked up, and his eyes were red-rimmed and entirely unembarrassed about it. Thank you, Ms. Kowalski. Sarah, she said. Sarah. He nodded once. Thank you. She walked to the elevator and pressed the button for the lobby. The doors closed, and she stood alone in the small metal box as it descended, and she allowed herself, privately, completely, to feel the full relief of it, the full weight of what the night had been, and what it had not become. The doors opened. She went home to her daughter. The formal proceedings began 8 days later, but the reckoning started the morning the article was published, and it was neither tidy nor cinematic. Justice, Sarah had spent 15 years learning, rarely was. It was paperwork in conference rooms and the slow grinding work of accountability structures that exist for precisely this purpose and that everyone forgets about until they are suddenly, desperately needed. Harrison was suspended with pay pending review the morning the article ran. The suspension became a formal investigation when, within the following week, 2 things happened in sequence. First, a former St. Michael's paramedic came forward, having read the article, to describe a conversation with Harrison 6 months prior in which the doctor had asked, with careful, calculated ambiguity, about the standard procedure for extended workup timelines on patients without verified coverage. Second, the medical board's investigators, reviewing the 18-month-old Iron Ravens case that Okafor had flagged, found that Harrison's documented response time for a penetrating trauma patient was 42 minutes from arrival to first physician contact, nearly 7 times the national standard. That patient was Jared Sparky Castillo, 22 years old, who had lost his spleen and a section of his bowel to complications that faster intervention might have prevented. He was alive. He had a colostomy bag. He gave a formal statement to the medical board that was 13 pages long and had been, he said, waiting inside him for a year and a half. The Vega cartel connection took longer. It was not the medical board's jurisdiction, but it was Jake's and eventually the federal prosecutors. By day 10, Jake's second article had documented 3 payments made to a shell company registered to a man with direct ties to the Vega organization, payments that had coincided with 3 separate Iron Ravens members receiving what the article called demonstrably substandard emergency care. Harrison's lawyers called it circumstantial. The federal prosecutor called it a beginning. Detective Mike Russo was placed on administrative leave by the Boston Police Department 4 days after the story broke. The announcement occupied 4 sentences in the Globe's Metro section. It felt inadequate. It was a beginning. At the hospital board meeting on day 12, Dr. Patricia Okafor presented her findings for 2 hours and 14 minutes without a break and without a wasted word. She presented Sarah's documentation. She presented the medical board's preliminary findings. She presented the pattern across 11 cases in Harrison's patient history. A statistically anomalous outcome disparity correlated with patient affiliation with specific criminal organizations, with the precision of a woman who had been building this case in her mind for 9 years and had never allowed herself to present it until she could make it impossible to dismiss. The board voted to terminate Harrison's hospital privileges. The vote was 7-2. His medical license was suspended by the Massachusetts Medical Board pending full revocation proceedings 3 days after that. Sarah was formally cleared of all misconduct by Dr. Okafor's review on day 10. The process had involved 3 interviews, 2 written statements, and a 90-minute conversation with a hospital attorney that covered every decision she had made between 1:43 a.m. and 6:02 a.m. on the night of the accident. At the end of the conversation, the attorney put down his pen and said, with a weariness that sounded like honesty, "For the record, Ms. Kowalski, what you did was irregular. And also correct." Sarah went home that evening and sat on Emma's bed while her daughter did homework and told her, in the simplified version that 12-year-olds deserve, what had happened. The important parts. The choice she had made, and what it had cost, and what it hadn't. Emma listened with her characteristic watchfulness. The watchfulness of a child who had grown up with a parent who did serious work and understood, earlier than most children should, that the world contains things that require courage. "Were you scared?" Emma asked. "Very," Sarah said. "But you did it anyway." "Yes." Emma considered this for a long, serious moment. Then she looked back at her homework. Good, she said. It was a Wednesday, 2 weeks and 3 days after the night of the accident, when Sarah pulled into the St. Michael's parking lot for her 7 a.m. shift and stopped her car. She sat for a moment and looked. Motorcycles, not 12, somewhere above 60, arranged in lines with the geometric precision of a military formation. Chrome catching the early morning light. Iron Raven's Crozon tank after gleaming tank. Boston plates. Rhode Island. Connecticut. New York. New Hampshire. Pennsylvania. Massachusetts road cuts and the colors of allied clubs she didn't know by name. The Steel Brotherhood, the Granite Kings, the Harbor Watch. Every rider was standing beside their bike, waiting. And at the center of the parking lot, flanked by Roadblock and Shepard and the young one who she now knew was called Sparrow, was Marcus Malone. Sarah parked. She got out of her car. She was aware of the strangeness of it. The nurse in teal scrubs walking towards 60-some motorcycle club members in a hospital parking lot at 6:52 in the morning. And she was also aware, with a clarity she didn't entirely understand, that this was exactly right. That everything the night had been pointing toward this moment. Not toward drama or spectacle, but toward this. This meeting, in the open air, between people who had nothing in common except that they had seen each other clearly in the dark and had not looked away. Miss Kowalski, Marcus said. Mr. Malone. She stopped in front of him. How's Danny? Marcus smiled. A real smile, open and warm. The first she'd seen from him, and it changed his face completely. Home since yesterday. Currently occupying my couch, eating everything in my kitchen, and complaining that daytime television is insulting to the human intellect. A pause. He asked me to tell you, and I quote verbatim, "Tell the nurse she's a badass." Sarah laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of her, the kind that comes from somewhere below thought. Then Marcus reached back, and Roadblock placed something in his hand, a steel document case, latched and heavy with purpose. Marcus held it out to Sarah with both hands, like something formal, like something that mattered. The club wants you to have this, he said. No strings, no conditions, no obligations of any kind. He paused, and when he spoke again his voice had the careful, deliberate weight of a man choosing each word because the words are important. This is not a transaction. It is not payment for services rendered. It is a recognition, from men who understand, in their bones, what it costs to stand up when standing up is hard. We have been in that position, not in the same way you were, but we know the terrain. Sarah took the case. It was heavier than she'd expected. She opened the latch. $100,000. Banded and counted, clean and neat. She looked up. Marcus met her eyes. The club runs legitimate businesses. 4 auto shops, a trucking company, a bar in Quincy. For years we've maintained a community fund, money set aside for people who've been wronged by systems that were supposed to protect them. A brief pause. It turns out those people are sometimes nurses. Behind him, the assembled riders were quiet. 60-some men in road leather, standing beside their machines in the morning light of a hospital parking lot, watching this happen. Sarah looked at them, really looked, and what she saw was not what she might have expected to see before the night of the accident. She saw men who had driven from 5 states to stand in a parking lot at 7 in the morning. She saw men who understood, from the shape of their own lives, what it meant when someone chose the difficult right thing over the easy wrong one. She saw men who had come because the occasion required witnesses. She closed the case carefully. I have a daughter, she said. Her voice was steady. Her name is Emma. She's 12 years old. She wants to be a doctor. She looked at Marcus. This money is going into her education fund. Whatever she becomes, doctor, engineer, nurse, architect, it doesn't matter. She'll get there partly because of this. Partly because of all of you. She looked out at the assembled riders. She'll know where it came from, she said. I'll make sure she knows. Somewhere behind Marcus, an engine caught. A deep, burbling Harley rumble that rolled through the chest like a second heartbeat. Then another. Then another. Then all of them, one after another in the crisp morning air, filling the parking lot with that sound. That layered, enormous, living sound that is not noise, but something closer to music felt in the sternum, in the place where things are understood before they are processed. Marcus Malone extended his hand one last time. Sarah Kowalski shook it. He held it for a moment. Both of them still in the rolling engine sound, in the chrome light, in the strange and ordinary morning. Take care of yourself, he said. You too, she said. Tell Danny to eat his vegetables. Marcus laughed. And it was a good laugh, the laugh of a man who has been given his brother back. Then he turned and swung his leg over his bike, and the Iron Ravens rolled out of the St. Michael's parking lot in formation, 60 machines moving as one body, turning onto Commonwealth Avenue, the sound of them receding into the morning like something vast returning to its natural element. Sarah stood in the parking lot with the steel case in her hands and felt the silence that followed. Then she straightened her lanyard, tucked the case under her arm, and walked through the sliding glass doors to start her shift. 3 months after the accident, Sarah Kowalski received the Outstanding Nursing Practice Award from the Massachusetts Nursing Association. She accepted it on a stage at the Boston Convention Center, in front of 400 nurses and healthcare professionals, wearing a black dress and heels she bought specifically for the occasion. Emma sat in the third row in a gray blazer, wearing her mother's old stethoscope around her neck for luck, with the serious-eyed attention of a 12-year-old who understands that some moments belong to the permanent record. Sarah had thought about what she would say for a long time. She thought about it in the car on the way to the ceremony. She thought about Danny Malone's Compass Rose tattoo, and Marcus's face in the waiting room at 2:30 a.m. saying please, and Roadblock covering his eyes with one enormous hand in a surgery waiting room, and Priya Patel pulling on her gloves and saying get me an ultrasound, and Dr. Okafor arriving at 4 a.m. because someone had called and said something very wrong was happening. She thought about Harrison, about Russo, about how easily it could have gone differently, how many times, in how many hospitals, in how many systems, it probably had gone differently, and no one had been there to stop it. She stepped to the microphone. I did not do anything extraordinary, she said. I did the ordinary thing, the most ordinary, basic, fundamental thing that every person in this room signed up to do when they became a nurse. I chose the patient. I chose the person in front of me over the politics around me. She paused. That's not heroism. That's the job. The room was quiet. But sometimes, she said, the job looks like heroism from the outside. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, the world sees it. And the world answers back. She looked out at the audience. She thought about a man who had been raised by his brother. She thought about a brother who would carry what that cost for the rest of his life, and carry it without complaint, because that was simply who he was. She thought about Emma, right there in the third row, watching. Take care of your patients, Sarah Kowalski said. Take care of the person in front of you. Don't let fear of consequences be louder than the voice that tells you what's right. She looked down at the award in her hands. The rest tends to follow. Jared Sparky Castillo filed a civil suit against Harrison and St. Michael's Hospital 3 months after the accident. It settled 18 months later for a sealed amount described by his attorney as life-changing. Dr. Richard Harrison's medical license was formally revoked by the Massachusetts Medical Board. He was subsequently indicted on federal bribery charges. His trial was pending. Detective Mike Russo retired from the Boston Police Department during his internal affairs investigation. He was later named as an unindicted co-conspirator in the federal case. Danny Ghost Malone enrolled in an online engineering program the following fall semester. On Sarah's birthday that year, he sent a card covered in hand-drawn crows. It said, "Because of you, I get to be an engineer. Thank you for not giving up on my brother. Thank you for not giving up on me. DM." Emma Kowalski, for years later, was accepted to pre-med at Boston University. She told her admissions essay interviewer that her inspiration was her mother, and a night she was 12 years old, and a parking lot full of motorcycles in the early morning light.